Just to tell you a little bit about Take Part, our mission is to confront racism and to engage in dismantling the systems that perpetuate ingrained racial inequality. We do this through events, education, and outreach that foster engagement in building a community where all people are treated with equality and respect. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed in the presentations at Take Part events are those of the individuals. They do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Take Part or its members. Take Part affirms that the Portland area is the rightful homeland of the Kathlamet, Clackamas, Chinook peoples, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, and the many other Native people who live here, who have always lived here, and who have always belonged to and cared for this land. Tonight's event is made possible in part by the local spiritual assembly of the Baha'is of Portland and by contributions from individual donors like you. We work in partnership with the Association for Human Advancement and Development. So that we currently have two ways that you can donate. There is a donation link that's available on our website. And also, as several of you have already discovered, there is an option to make a donation when you get your free ticket on Eventbrite. And we really appreciate everybody who makes those donations. Thank you very much. We have a few communication agreements. First is listen more, and keep listening even when you're uncomfortable. You might hear some things that feel challenging initially. You might hear some things that you don't agree with, but take the time to listen and keep listening even when that discomfort arises. Engage tension, but don't indulge drama. The acronym WAIT, why am I talking? Always a good one. Consultation and collaboration and not competition. No one needs to win a discussion at our events. Also, maintain a safe space for difficult conversations. That means that we take away the lessons learned and the insights gained, and we leave behind who said what. So the way it'll go this evening is everyone will be muted until the question and answer period. If you have a question that comes up during the presentation, you can use the chat. The button for that is found at the bottom of your screen on Zoom. And then during the Q&A portion, you can use the reactions button on your screen, and you can use the raise hand feature. So if you prefer to ask your questions just in the chat box, that's fine, and somebody will find and read that question for you. However, if you want to be on video and ask your question that way, that will also be welcome during the Q&A portion, and you can raise your hand to do that. And as always, please keep your comments and questions concise and respectful. So welcome to our November event, Raising Up Socially Conscious Anti-Racist Communities for Our Children and the Generations to Come. We are absolutely thrilled to have Katharine Phelps here with us this evening. Katharine Phelps has a bachelor's in family studies from the University of Maryland and a master's degree in education from New York University. Her professional work and service has centered around early childhood education, literacy, and community building with a particular focus on young children. She has taught in public and private settings in China, Israel, New York, Washington, and Oregon. She is currently an elementary school teacher, and since September 2020, she has been part of a small and dedicated team with the nonprofit group Respond to Racism that organizes virtual events for young children centering narratives that portray a wide range of representations and experiences of Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. I will turn it over to Katharine. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It is a pleasure to be with you this evening and to be a part of this wonderful initiative. And as Donna mentioned, I'm going to be talking primarily around children, and that's my background is in early childhood education, specifically elementary age students. And really with Take Part's mission of dismantling systems that are racist and ingrained racial inequalities, I can think of no more important space to begin than that with our children, because every generation that follows ours really holds the promise of us making our world a better place. And so what I'm going to be talking about this evening is is sort of in two different parts. And let me just bring up my PowerPoint here. So the first part, I'll share some research highlights that come from a paper that was done by a PhD professor, Aaron Winkler, out of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And it just looks at how young children learn race. So I'll share some of the highlights of that research and what some of the studies have found. And then I'll share some of the frameworks and mindsets that may be helpful to us as community members and as families, parents, people who maybe work in caregiver settings, and of course, as a wider community that are responsible for ensuring the safety and security of all of our children. So here are some of the research highlights from the paper. And at the end, I'll share a resource document, and I will include this because there are a lot of details that I'll just sort of share briefly, but you can dig in and sort of find more on what the research shares. So the first idea is that research has disproved the popular belief that children only have racial biases if they're directly taught to have them, right? It's not always the case that children's racial beliefs are reliably related to those of their parents. So this isn't saying that parents are not passing down racist or prejudicial beliefs or attitudes, but children are motivated to learn and conform to the broader cultural and social norms of their communities and society. They gather information from a broad range of sources, not just their families, and they actively construct their own beliefs from the information that they're absorbing from the world around them. So we know, for example, that children see color. In a study that was done, they followed approximately 200 Black and white children from the ages of 6 months to 6 years. And what they found was that infants were able to non-verbally categorize unfamiliar adults by their phenotype, their skin color, as well as by their gender. And so the problem, though, isn't that children are seeing race or seeing skin color. It's the messages that they are prescribing and associating with those races, with that skin color, that bring up the issues of that are the issues that we're encountering. The second thing that the researchers found was that even if adults do not explicitly mention or endorse particular ideas around race, children notice patterns in their environment and make inferences about differences between groups. And so they notice these patterns and they infer that the patterns they are seeing about the way that people treat other people or their engagements or their interactions, they infer that these patterns that they're seeing must be caused by something meaningful or meaningfully inherent in the differences between these two groups. So although children often attach meaning to race without adults, so even though adults may not be directly telling them things about race, the biases that children have and exhibit are not random. So they often reflect the subtle and not so subtle messages about the value of belonging to one social group as opposed to another. So children, for example, pick up on the ways in which whiteness is normalized and privileged in US society. And consciously or unconsciously, the white middle-class culture is presented as a norm or a standard in our country. And that is in terms of appearance, beauty, language, cultural practices, food. And so that message, this message permeates the daily lives of our children. And it comes in different forms. It comes in the form of picture books, children's movies, television, music, curriculums. And so what we do as caregivers and as members of the wider community, the messages that we hold in our own hearts and then also exhibit in our behaviors towards others matters, because children see it and they pick up on it. Even if it's seemingly small, they pick up on how we treat other people who are different from us. So what should we do? So one of the first things that the researchers found that was important was that we should talk about race, talk about racial differences, racism, and racial inequality with children. Adults are often silent on the issue of race, prejudice, and racial inequity. And that's a lot of the time it's because we ourselves are not comfortable talking about it. So sometimes we give no information or we give inaccurate information because we don't fully understand how racism works. We don't always understand why racial inequalities and inequities exist in our society, especially so many years after the civil rights movement. And we ourselves also have to remember that we're uncomfortable because we too sort of grew up in environments where we were taking in subtle and not so subtle messages of cultural racism on a daily basis. And so what's interesting is that researchers have found that parents are often comfortable talking about gender issues, and they'll talk about that freely with their children, but not about race. And the thing is that the silence doesn't keep children from asking questions, and it doesn't keep children from noticing race. And it certainly doesn't keep them from developing racial biases and prejudices. What it does do is it keeps them from talking about it. And after a while, children who have been silenced often enough learn not to talk about race publicly. Their questions don't go away, they just go unasked. So as adults, we don't want to shush our children or shut down conversations. And we really want to educate ourselves and do the internal work and the emotional work that will allow us to engage in open, honest, frequent, and age-appropriate conversations about race and racial inequality. And research has shown that these kinds of conversations with children are associated with lower levels of bias in young children. We're not putting ideas in their heads when we talk about race. Young children already notice race. They're already drawing conclusions about difference on their own. So, and avoiding the conversations about race only encourages the prevalence of stereotypes to remain unchanged. So some of the things that we want to do in environments where we notice race or we notice discrimination is for us to actually address it directly. So when we see, so if you're an educator in a school, for example, when you see name calling or other discrimination happening in your immediate environment, and if it goes unnoticed or it goes undiscussed by the adults, children infer that that behavior is accepted. When we don't say something, when we see something discriminatory or bullying, children believe that this is okay, this is acceptable. And so it's been found that addressing issues of race and racism directly are really important for children and students to get the message that this is not acceptable here. This isn't how we do things. And this is especially important in classrooms where there is little to no racial or ethnic diversity. We really want to be addressing explicitly issues of race and racism and racial inequality. Children pick up about these ideas. I'll just, reiterate that idea, that they're going to pick up these ideas. And the less actual meaningful contact that students and children have with people from other racial groups besides their own, the more likelier they are to have higher levels of prejudice. So it's important that we make it an intentional and explicit part of their education in the different environments they're in. Another thing that is important in educating children in relation to race is to encourage complex thinking. Studies have shown, and I'll be talking a little bit about this later in the second half of my thoughts tonight, but studies have shown that teaching young children to think in more complex ways can be an effective way in reducing prejudice. So when children are taught to think and pay attention to multiple attributes of a person, not just race or not just one single dimension, reduced levels of bias are shown. So in addition to giving accurate information about race and racism, we want to focus on teaching children to think critically and in multiple dimensions. We also want to empower our children to fight against racial inequity and discrimination. This could be one of the most important things we do. We want to provide children with ideas about how to fight against the continuing racial inequities and discriminations that we see in our society. We want to empower them to help them actively seek out anti-racist role models in our communities and in our broader society. And we can expose them to those role models. And we can show children, and this is really important, we can show children that while we do face problems in our society, there are people and there are organizations like this one that are invested in making a positive change. We want to show children that they can help too, and involve them in projects that allow real participation in the progress of change. And I think a lot of this is really about the frameworks and the mindsets that we as adults participate and engage in. A big part of acting on some of the things we know around race and around how we raise prejudice-free children are really about getting comfortable with change and building habits and capacities within ourselves that will make us better adults and role models for them. So I'll share a couple of interesting things that I was listening to in a podcast. So a significant number, and I'll start just by sharing that a significant number of us believe that racism is wrong, that diversity and equity are important to uphold in our institutions and our personal spheres of influence, but our beliefs do not always translate into action. And much of our lives and actions are not driven necessarily by conscious and deliberate intention. Even when we believe in what it is we want to change, we don't always move in our intention. And so I'll give a couple of examples. the first example was a campaign that was done it started in California, but it was looking at how to get people to eat 5 fruits and vegetables a day, 5 days a week. So in the 1990s, only 8% of the US population realized that they needed to eat 5 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. 5 years later, over a third of Americans held the belief that they should eat 5 fruits and vegetables. So they did this long campaign for over 5 years where they sort of brought in public PSAs around it and getting people to sort of understand the importance and value of eating these servings of fruits and vegetables. But when you looked at what people were doing with their actions and behaviors, they were not aligned with their beliefs. So before the campaign, 8% of us were actually eating 5 fruits and vegetables a day, 5 servings. And 10 years later, it was only 11%. So what the study sort of learned was that much of our eating is habitual, right? What we do is actually just from habit. We shop automatically, and when we go to the store, we go down certain aisles in the grocery store, and our behaviors are shaped by the environment we are in and the patterns that have been shaped by that environment. And for many of us, this actually plays out directly in our own lives, right? So most of us believe in diversity. We want to engage with other races and cultures, but we don't necessarily have diversity in our lives. And what's more, we're not always aware that it's not actually present. And so what can sometimes happen is because we believe in something, like, for example, diversity, we believe that we are actively engaging with it in our daily lives. And so I'll share with you a little something that may be helpful. I had a teacher friend of mine who shared this with me, and I've had a couple of people share that this was actually really helpful in getting them to see very clear, explicitly what were the spaces of diversity and engagement in their lives. And so what I would like you to do is, this is not something we're going to share in a large group. You're not going to put it in the chat. You're not going to put it anywhere. But grab a piece of paper and grab a pen or pencil, anything to just sort of not, jot things down. And I'm going to show you a list of different categories that may happen in your lives, things that may be present in your life. And I want you to think about the race or the ethnicity of that person that is related, that relates to that category of that activity. And so I'll just take a couple of minutes, and you can just jot, a quick note of their race or ethnicity. So what you may find is that even with these sort of surface level check-ins, they can help give us a reading of our reality, our sort of material reality and the experiences that we have, and sort of give us a gauge as to whether there are other or more opportunities for us to discover where we might have expansion in our lives, right? And where we might consider how we can begin to align what we say is important to us with actual engagement in being with people in those spaces. And the other thing I want to talk about is the importance of setting up structures and environments that help us to support the change that we want to see. So we just talked about how that intention, that belief, translating into action. So that intention isn't unimportant, right? That intention, having that intention is an important first step. Because we do have to hold wanting to engage with others and to have diversity in our lives. We do have to hold that as something that's important to us, but it has to translate into movement, right? And sometimes what we find is that environments and structures are really important to us being able to manifest that change and to do the things we say that are important to us. And so an interesting analysis actually of cigarette smoking and how we reduce cigarette smoking in our country really actually made me think about the importance of putting up structures that place us into the act of intention, place us into those spaces where we want to move and the things we want to do. So this also came from Hidden Brain, which is a podcast that looks at how our behaviors and our cognitive thinking, our behaviors actually line up, and who are we and how do we do what we do, or why do we do what we do? And in this particular study, they were looking at cigarettes and smoking. And it picks up in the study by sort of telling us by the time the Surgeon General's report came out about the dangers of smoking in the 1960s, people already had a pretty good idea that smoking was bad for their health, right? And they needed to stop smoking. But in fact, the sale of cigarettes increased in the 1970s. So people were convinced that cigarette smoking was bad for their health. They knew it wasn't good for them, but they kept doing it. And it was only once we started modifying the environment that people's behavior started to change, right? So warning labels were put on cigarette packs. Vending machines were removed that had cigarettes. There are now rules about how you could purchase cigarettes. They're now typically put behind a counter, and you have to ask in order to purchase them. We set bans on smoking in public spaces. And then we also started taxing cigarettes. It took huge political decision making and commitment to make the changes that would make it easier for us to do the thing that we already knew was important for us to do, to smoke less. When we want to make change, we have to be intentional, and we also have to set up our environments and our structures to aid us towards being the person we want to be and acting upon the change that we want to see. So how do we set ourselves up for success? How do we set ourselves up for expansion? What sort of structures and environments do we set up for our children in classrooms, in schools, in our homes, right? How do we structure things so that children understand and see that we really are expansive and we really do engage with our own biases, our own prejudices. We engage with wanting to expand and to relate to others in ways that are meaningful and profound when they're outside of our comfort zone, or they're outside of what our own habits and where we are comfortable, the circles we are comfortable in. And so one of the things that psychologists have sort of studied is this idea of counter stereotypes. And studies show that counter stereotypes help individuals to reduce their biases and shift out of stereotypic thinking. So counter stereotypes are things that go against what you already think you know about a group or about a person. They're things that sort of change and shift you out of your preconceived notions and ideas about who that group is, how they behave, what they do, what they believe. And when we increase the categories and attributes we use to define others, it reduces our heuristic thinking, right? That heuristic thinking is when we make these mental models, we make these shortcuts in order to make judgments. And those shortcuts, those heuristic models that we have are important for certain things in our life, right? Like we do have to make shortcuts when we're getting up in the morning, like and going to brush our teeth. We don't want to have to think through all of the steps of what it takes to brush our teeth. But the mental shortcuts that we make when it comes to people can be harmful, right? And so when we create counter stereotypes and think about other ways that we can think about people, we become motivated to pay attention to the unexpected. And what's really interesting about these counter stereotypes is how they work, right? Counter stereotypes and counter narratives elicit a feeling of surprise. They work in an affective way, right? And when we're surprised by something, that feeling of surprise motivates our curiosity and our information seeking, right? A cognitive shift is created and we become more careful and we become more accurate in information processing. We show less biased emotions and are prompted to think more carefully and more thoroughly about the essence of others. Thinking about people through the lens of multiple attributes heightens our humanization of others and improves our attitudes and our behaviors towards them. And so when I mentioned earlier that one of the things that children need to reduce their biases and prejudices and expand their idea of other is the idea that they have they learn about multiple ways of seeing people. And I think of this in a very personal way. When I learned about this idea several years ago, I actually genuinely started to put it into practice in my own life, particularly when I moved back to the United States and was bombarded with a media that really seems to feed on if it bleeds, it leads, right? So the idea of all of these negative images and ideas coming at you, and it's not that all of them are wrong or bad, but sometimes we can take in these narratives and not consider other things. And I remember was several years ago, I was reading a year or two ago, I was reading an article on the tension between the African-American community and the Korean community in a particular area. And I felt like the first thing that triggered my mind was just this anger, and I wasn't sort of dissecting who I was angry at, but it was triggering the stereotypes I had of groups of these groups, right? And so I said, I actually slowed down because I said, what I need right now are some counter narratives. I need some other stories that tell me that there is actually not always tension between these two groups. There is actually solidarity that happens between these two groups. And when I went to look for it, I found it, right? When I went to look for things that countered my stereotypes of how African Americans feel towards Asians and how Asians feel towards African Americans, I actually look for it. And I'm telling you, it's actually just as simple as a Google search on a group and then a word like unity or solidarity, and you start to see things come up. And so I actually went down this long trail because a person had put together a website and a blog on different historical experiences where African Americans and Asians had come together to protest or had come together to enact social change and justice. And so I kept in my heart sort of images like this, right? Where that countered that idea of there's always this sort of tension between these two groups. And I kept things like this where there are people, there are individuals who want to see that change. And so these counter narratives were really important in doing that. And you have to find them. You actually have to go look for them because they won't always be fed to you. And they won't always be fed to our children, right? So these are the kinds of things we want to be giving our children. We want to be giving them the truth about our racial history, right? At these age-appropriate stages. And at the same time, we want to be expanding their idea of what these groups that have been historically marginalized and silenced, they had existences, they had they were here before. For example, in the case of African Americans, they were doctors and midwives and architects and lawyers and mothers, right? Before they were brought as slaves, they had entire cultures and civilizations, right? Their history did not begin with their enslavement, right? That's a choice that we made. That like we have a rich history from around the world of all of these groups that we have chosen to put into these castes and hierarchies. So having these counter stereotypes and sharing them with our children so that they have rich schemas, so that we and they have rich schemas to set ourselves up, right? To create that space where we think about groups with more complexity and more nuance is going to help in reducing the prejudice that may come from the messaging they're getting from all of these different places. And we want those representations of people of color to be very wide representations, right? Lots of different kinds of people. There were early aviators of color, right? Here in Portland, we have the first Chinese American woman who was a fighter she helped to test the planes for World War II. We have African American women were pilots in the world wars. So it's one of those things where we want to think about all the different places where people of color live, and go to Twitter, go to Instagram, find groups of people that, and then start to see images that counter the stereotypes of where we think people exist. And then, of course, there is the actual connection with people, right? And this is something that has been studied quite a bit, this idea of intergroup contact theory, that when there is contact between two groups, prejudice is reduced. It attenuates, it lessens the implicit associations that the group that you belong to is good and the group someone else belongs to is bad. When we start to have positive experiences with people outside of our own group, it reduces psychological sort of threat responses, and it induces positive affects such as empathy. And that increasing that positive contact works on multiple levels, right? For our children and for ourselves. Cognitively, we learn about other groups. And in that learning, we also reappraise how we think about our own group, right? At a behavioral level, when we have these positive experiences with other people, we begin to open ourselves up to the potential of positive experiences in contact with people outside of our own group. At an affective level, at an emotional level, we create ties and friendship that reduce negative emotions. And it's interesting because there's recent studies suggesting that the contact doesn't even necessarily have to be direct or face-to-face. I personally think that's most ideal, but there have been situations we know of in history where that hasn't been possible. You know, and in the studies, they spoke specifically about Northern Ireland, where it was just nigh impossible for the Protestant and the Catholics to come together. But what they found was that even the contact wasn't necessarily face-to-face. There was evidence supporting the idea or the theory that just the knowledge that a member of your group had a close relationship with a member of the other group could actually improve attitudes. And even just imagining that contact with another group could improve our attitudes and reduce our biases and our prejudices. And so getting to know other people in our work, in our community, and connecting with them actively, like going out and seeking friendships for our children, and for ourselves, you know, helps us to expand the way that we think about other people and increases empathy. And so I just want to wrap up by considering, you know, for each of us to consider our spheres of influence, right? We know that we have to be intentional. We have to be intentional models for our children. They have to see us, you know, opening and expanding our engagement through our whatever environments we have. You know, and so the question becomes, where can we make the impact? You know, we work on ourselves. We consider our family. You know, what sort of books are in the home? What sort of movies do we watch together? What kind of music are we listening to? When we go out, where do we visit? What sort of restaurants? I mean, these are all the low-hanging fruits that I think of, but they're not actually that low when you think about what impact they have on what children learn about what it says to you, that you want to do this with your time, or that you want to make these connections with people. What about your work environment? You know, how do we connect with people, engage with people there? Our schools to me are sort of ground zero for a lot of these things. You know, when I give this a similar talk to educators, I go in a whole other direction. I suggest an audit of our classroom libraries, right? You go in, you actually, a teacher did this. It was really powerful, and I have links to that, but she did a literal spreadsheet, and an older teacher, a teacher with older students, engaged the students in taking every book out of their classroom library and statistically noting who was represented. And not just who was represented, but how were they represented in those books? And where were the gaps? You know, where were those representations Did they always fall into the same sorts of, were all of the people, were all of the boys always in sports? You know, were the depictions of men always in sports? You know, so they would look at the different dimensions of that library, and then they had to talk about it. They talked about it. Who's represented here? Who's not? What can we do? You know, that seems to me like really accessible, can-do sort of things that we can inculcate in our classrooms. You know, in our PTOs. You know, what kind of questions do our PTOs ask of our administration? What kind of events do we sponsor? Where do we put our money? You know, for our libraries, are our libraries diverse? Do children not only see themselves, but do they see others? Our faith communities, right? I mean, if this can be a really wonderful opportunity, if there's cohesion and there's this assumption of love, and that we act in these spaces of love, we can listen to one another and learn whether everyone feels included really. That should be a space where that can happen. What sort of recreational groups and hobbies are we involved in? My mother's in a quilting guild, and that quilting guild really has taken up anti-racism as a platform. They are trying to find members of diversity. They try to get involved in quilting as activism. So they've tried to find ways to make something that is a love for them and a joy, and take it to a place where it actually contributes to change. One of the biggest spaces that we can make a change is who we elect on our school boards. It really does trickle down. You know, once we start to learn about the dog whistling, and this is something I think is important for us to do, is to actually read about our history, to actually understand how racism manifests today. We have a tendency to think about racism as something that is just individual, right? It's not something that is just when an individual says something that is derogatory or racist, that is not the only way that racism occurs. And if you haven't had the chance to watch, I think it's Markeisha Smith take part, has on their YouTube site, has a really wonderful talk hosted by Markeisha Smith. And she talks a lot more about this, like how does white supremacy show up as a cultural element in our schools and our workplaces. And one of the things she brings up is not uncommon to see around, but is this idea of all the other ways that that prejudice can manifest itself. And so to become familiar and to make sure that you understand what people are saying and what they're not saying and what they're supporting and what they're not supporting is important, because we want to consider who we elect to those school boards, because they actually determine what will be supported, what kind of diversity and equity work will be supported and what won't. And you can just look to Newburgh to sort of get a sense. I haven't been following that closely, but we in Respond to Racism had a whole community meeting on it last month, and it was very profound and very powerful to hear the teenagers who are experiencing what it happens when a school board does not support diversity and equity. So to think about our responsibility as citizens and our responsibility and this in relating this to the idea of structures and how we have to create the structures that allow us to be the better humans that we need to be. Those structures are things like school boards and who is in these institutions. Those structures are things like the politicians we elect and the policies and the legislation that they push forward. You know, if we understand and really sort of independently investigate what the impact is of the decisions that they make, we'll at least use our vote in the best way we can to put people forward who actually are looking at how we can change the structures, because that's just as important in change as our personal work, what we do as individuals, and what our community, our society does to eradicate this insidious disease is important in our institutions. And so, yeah, so that leaves me with some resources I thought I could share with you. I will put them here in the chat. A book that I strongly recommend. I just started this book. Excuse me 1 second. Let me just grab the share. I just started this book and I've been reading it whenever I have a moment, is The Sum of Us: What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. This book really lays out the picture of how racism is harming us, right? It's harming all of us, and how it and how by coming together, the dividends, the benefits of when we choose to cross our interracial lines and create a solidarity among us. And she's an economist, so she's coming at it from a material view about how it just every time it manifests in everyone benefiting materially and economically, but there really is a heart to her book and a strong sense of emotion about wanting to create this change. So let me just put that in the chat, and then I will open this resource document in the chat. And I'll open up to Q&A if anyone has any thoughts or questions. I welcome them.
Thank you so much, Katharine. That was a lot. That was a lot to think about and a lot to process. And I personally really appreciated the cues for self-reflection and thinking about myself and my environments, both the environments that I enter into and the environments that I have control over and influence over. And I've got a lot to think about with those things. I often don't think of myself as an influential person. And I'm sure I'm not the only person who makes that mistake. And if more of us took advantage of the influence that we do have, we really could start to change some of these structures.
Beautifully put, Donna. Yeah.
So if you'd like to ask a question, you can put it in the chat, or you're welcome to raise your hand. So Randy has a question. With regards to the studies you cited about children and race, it seems that most of the same behaviors apply to adults as well. Would you agree? Could you talk more about the differences between talking about race with children and adults?
Yes. Well, what is interesting about that is there is a difference, for example, in how early parents talk to children about race. African-American parents, for example, tend to talk about race to children much earlier than white parents do, as an example. So African-American children are, because they're priming their children, right? They're priming their children for what they know is out there, that the prejudice that they may encounter, the children have already encountered it most likely, and the parents are seeing it. And so they're preparing them for a world where it is likely that they will face discrimination. And so African-American parents tend to talk to their children early and young about race, and early and young about those identity pieces, right? Who you are, this is where we came from, this is our history, and sort of grounding them in that space so that they can sort of not always have these experiences, this trauma of racism or prejudice will at least be somewhat buffered by these comments or discussions. I don't think they can be, but that's where they start. But parents who, but oftentimes white parents, like the studies suggest, will often think that you're planting ideas, you're causing the problem, you're putting things, you're bringing up things that they wouldn't even think about. And so there's a tendency to believe that talking about it openly, explicitly is part of the problem. This is where the problem lies. And I think we see that mirrored with adults as well, right? I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had conversations and people are like, you just think about this a little too much. And I'm thinking, people who are the minoritized or the marginalized are accused of causing the problem, of bringing up issues, of making this a thing, without people acknowledging and taking accountability for the behaviors, their own behaviors, or the historical record that shows where these go, how these things all began. And so I think part of it is recognizing as adults that we ourselves have to get comfortable with having the conversations and understanding our history and being honest and truthful about our history and taking accountability for that. And then being prepared to have conversations about it. You know, different people have different ideas about what's appropriate and what's age appropriate for children. I remember hearing an interesting perspective from in one of our Respond to Racism talks on critical race theory. And one of the things that one of the guest speakers was saying, he had worked a lot with students, particularly in African-American communities in Chicago. And one of the things he felt was, you know, if children are young enough to experience racism, they're young enough to talk about it. And the thing is that it can't just be the African-American children who are having to talk about it all the time. You know, if we're placing this burden on them, shouldn't it be something we're all sort of dealing with, we're all managing? And I think, you know, I think you think about your context, you think about where you are. And like I said, I think you want to do, it's a both and. You want to talk about how this disease exists, and it is not simply just individuals who are ignorant, right? It is spaces and places that we have chosen to create that exclude others. It is curriculums that we have chosen that don't talk about things. So there's a lot of intention. So we want to talk about those inequities. We also want to be sure that children are getting a multiplicity of representations and ideas about who we as humans are. That we are more than just the color of our skin, but the color of our skin is affecting some of us more than others in ways that are detrimental to our entire humanity. So it's sort of this a dual process in our education.
Jane, you have a question? You are muted.
I noticed that. Oh my goodness, Katharine, this is so interesting. I have learned so much, and I'm really struck by your concept of rich schemas and more complexity. And it strikes me that you probably have a wealth of knowledge of children's books that can start that process really early on. And they might be in the references that you gave us, but it seems like there's so many more creative writers that I don't know about, that I'm sure you have your hands all over them, if that might be a topic you could address.
Yes, we do. I do sort of curate and think about books as a classroom teacher, and as doing work with Respond to Racism. We've thought a lot about, you know, books and representations. In the resource document I gave, let me see if I did it in this one. Let me take a look. It's a good question, Jane. Yes. Okay. So this is really interesting. There's a couple of sites that I've put on here. Uh-oh.
Good.
The fact that I can't open them concerns me. Oh, well, we'll just do it this way. Let me share my screen in just a second. I realize I'm not sharing my screen right now. Okay. So one of the things that I have in my resource doc that I just put in the chat is something called Diverse Book Finder. And this is a tool that a lot of librarians use. And one caveat I'll say is that Diverse Book Finder does not filter the quality of the books, right? It's just sort of telling you what's out there. Here are things. And one of the things I've done, so I was talking to you about counter stereotypes and how part of that is filling our minds, giving our schemas more to work with. And one of the things that I did was when I was doing a read aloud for some kids, and it was right around the time, any of you remember that story about Central Park, about Karen and how she became big in the news? It was a woman in Central Park, an African-American gentleman was bird watching. She saw him as a threat, thought he was threatening her, and her dog was off the leash, and the dog was getting in the way of his bird watching experience. So the dog was, I think, illegally off the leash, but he was there at the time when the birds are migrating, and he was just, trying to do this hobby. And she saw him as a threat. She's a white woman, and she saw him as a threat and called the police. And, this became, thankfully, he wasn't going to do much about it, but his sister sort of made put this out there, and it entered the Twitter sphere. And what was really interesting is that I think for a lot of people, this idea that a lot of people, I think, in communities of color were not surprised by this sort of behavior. Say, yeah, but I bet you there are people like, there are bird watchers of color. Like, I can promise you there were people where that was like, that exists. And so, of course, there are people of color who engage in bird watching. So I wanted the kids to know that, right? We wanted the kids to see for bird watchers. So, I just did, I went and hunted around for some things on the Audubon Society, and then looked for people. There are ornithologists and bird watcher communities that are led by people of color, like avid enthusiasts. So I showed videos of those things. So sort of countering, anytime I see a story in the news that makes me think, oh, this is something else kids shouldn't be aware of, or this is a space where you don't often see, or we're not told about, or shown or portrayed the people who are different than what we think belongs in that space. You just sort of, paying attention to the news and paying attention to our own stereotypes can help us know what the counter narratives are required for the children. Because if we're doing it, we're passing that off. What this is really neat. And I just sort of bring up that idea because you can go in and just as an example, if I wanted to see something on birds, I don't know if there is anything, I can see different stories, and all of these books center around people of color, right? And they talk about them in different ways. So there are 12 books related to birds that center Asian Pacific Islanders, 10 that are center African Americans. We have some that have Latina and Hispanic. And then, of course, there are also where there's cross-group interactions, which is also very important for children to see. They need to see, particularly if they're children of color, they need to see themselves because they are not given primacy in our culture in the same way. But we also need to see, all children need to see that there are people coming together. And so this is just a really neat initiative that was started, I believe it was at a university on the East Coast. And so, again, it doesn't filter for quality. So I will find a title. And then what I do is when I find a title and I want to make sure that it's something I really would want to show a child, I go to YouTube and I put in the title, I put read aloud. And inevitably, especially during COVID times, there's someone out there who has read this book, and it may not be the best reading, but you know, I'll put it on, if I'm having to see a whole bunch, I'll just put it on double speed, get a sense of the content, how I like the book, how it feels. If it doesn't have anything that sort of makes me go, whoa, then it just gives me a quick way to see if this might be something that I want to add to the repertoire or to my library. And then of course, spaces like this are going to give you ideas of highlight books and different things. I'm trying to see if I put something else. There's something else. Yeah, there's a lot of great, I did put some here, Jane, in the resource document. I did, because picture books to me, I'm sort of literacy based. I'm really, really about literacy. So I did put in just some different websites that center diversity. And I'm sort of, I think intersectionality is important. So it's representations of race, representations of gender, transgender issues, people in our communities, houselessness, you know, immigrants, you know, having people, you know, illnesses, people that have chronic illnesses or that are, or different disabilities, things that put us in lots of learning spaces and create lots of opportunities for us to see all of us in these places. So yes, and I really like this. So Jane, you have me on a roll now because
Thank you. No, I knew you'd be an amazing resource. That's fantastic. Thank you.
I love this stuff and I love her blog. This is another person who's really, really intentional about how she selects books. So I go to other people who are doing this, right? Because I have a full-time job and this is important to my job, but I have, you know, there are people, I think this is something else that I would say I should include in this talk at some point, is that we don't have to do all the work, right? We don't have to reinvent the wheel every time. We don't have to understand everything to do something. We, when, you know, anything worth doing is worth doing imperfectly. So we may, you know, it's important to reflect. It's important to think about the impact that we've had, but sometimes you won't know until you act and move in that space. And if there are people, literally the three things I just showed you are people who are dedicated to this. This is their life. And this is actually how they make a living. They do this. And so we can use one another. We can use our resources and identify the people in our community who are strong at this and who do this well. And so that we can move in our spaces and we can do our work without having to feel like we have to take on all of the research and all of the underlying things that may you know, make us comfortable. Certainly, I think sometimes we do that because it's paralysis from analysis, right? We kind of feel, I think a part of it is that we overthink and we overanalyze, and I'm certainly not supporting not thinking and not doing that. But sometimes we also can be fearful and intimidated, and that can hold us back.
Adrienne and Bernadette.
Hi, I would like you to consider what it would be like to attend a school which is fully integrated, or to live in a neighborhood which is fully integrated. I grew up in Oakland, California, and my neighborhood consisted of, I had a white neighbor on one side, a Chinese on the other, a Hispanic down the street, a Japanese American family around the corner. But more importantly, there was no white. People were Italian and Irish and German. And in my school, there were celebrations of each culture. And these are the days when the moms would come and cook food. And so we get to have a celebration of Italian or Filipino. And also there would be traditional dances the kids would do and costumes. And when kids grow up to see that complexity, it impacts how they feel about themselves and the world. And I still have two friends from grade school, a a Latinx man and a Filipino man, and we were together in San Francisco talking about how meaningful that was and how lucky we were to grow up that way. But more importantly, I live across the street from a family who is white, and I have known their children since they were born. And I am good friends with little Olivia, who is 10. And one of the car caravans came by for Black Lives Matters. And afterwards, the kids drew pictures for Black Lives Matters and put them in the windows. And so I let her mother know how important that was to me and to thank them. And Livia called me, and she told me that she belongs to the race group after school, where she learns about discrimination, and then she gets to go talk to the other kids in the other classes about discrimination, and she doesn't understand why people don't like people. And I said, some people don't have neighbors that don't look like them, so they never have a chance to understand that they're normal just like them. And I know that my being in Livia's life has had an impact on her willingness and ability to decide that all the groups she could belong to after school, this is where she's going, because I'm her friend and she's my friend. And I encourage you to make sure that your kids have the opportunity to actually do things with people of color. And if the schools they go to are mixed, that you encourage the schools to celebrate ethnicities, all of them, because people need to stop seeing themselves as white. They need to recognize that we are a multicultural environment. And then maybe we can have more discussions about how their grandparents and ancestors suffered from discrimination when they first came to America. And that would be the best of all. Thank you.
Thank you, Bernadette. A little teary-eyed.
Thank you, Bernadette. Sky, you had a question?
I did. Catherine, thank you so much. It's nice to see you. For me, it's a complicated question, so I'll just toss it out there, and I'm sure you can figure out a way to grab onto it. Well, what Bernadette was talking about is first of all, there's a lot of good ideas, and there's a lot of experience that she's speaking from, and there's not much disagreement, certainly in this group, I don't believe. So I'm wondering, what does it take? It feels to me like we're not moving the dial very quickly, if at all. And one step forward, two step backward, instead of two steps forward, one step backwards, it feels like sometimes. So in your opinion, in your experience, if you were trying to figure out, as you are, exactly how to go about making some of these changes, what skill sets do we need? What roles are needed? What kinds of organizations? And what will really move the dial? And you can take any or all of that, or you can just say, yeah, you're right, it's a big mess. But I'm really wondering, it feels to me sometimes like we've got ideas, but we don't have any step-by-step action plans. We don't have resources. And so if you could wave a wand, what do you think should be focused on? And would you agree that we don't always have the right people, we don't have them in the right roles? And anyway.
I think it's a human endeavor, right? I do really truly do understand your feeling of frustration and the feeling that movement and change is slow. And I often feel that. I often feel really disheartened by the things that I'm reading and the things I'm seeing. And, you know, particularly when I was outside of the US and we moved back about 7 years ago, I just sometimes could not understand what was happening here. It was just a shock. But I think we have to be realistic that when you have a country that has had 400 years of oppression, hundreds of years of slavery, then 100 years of Jim Crow, and then even today, groups who are absolutely intent on continuing to seed a divide and to uphold white supremacy actively, it's going to be 2 steps forward, 1 step forward and 2 steps back. I don't see how we can go through, decade after decade after decade after decade and not have cleaning to do, and not have some, not have things that aren't just not have a silver bullet. I just don't think it's possible. I think, Sky, you're absolutely correct that it is complex because, when we talk about these dimensions, there's other dimensions, right? There's issues of gender, there's issues of class, there are issues of other things that play into the systemic problems in our country. But when you peel away all of the layers, and there's a few, really profound books, and I've put them in the resource list here. Caste is one of them. Caste is a really profound book. The Sum of Us is a really profound look at what we're doing and how we do it. In fact, Sky, I would recommend reading the Sum of Us to sort of get an idea of how these problems keep persisting.
Yeah, we've read both of those, and I would also toss in there The Color of Law, because it points out some of the structure.
Yes, yeah, I have not read that. I watched some video and interviews on that. I listened to his interview on NPR a year or 2 ago, and that's absolutely. I think that we have to be vigilant. I just don't think there's any way around it. I don't think there's any way around us being individuals who keep working away. And I don't think there's anything around us using our civic powers, right? Our votes to get something done. The fact is, the personal is political. And what was very interesting in these studies, and it was a study on contact theory, the idea of these interracial groups. One of the things the researchers pointed out was the importance of maintaining vigilance, because what can happen is when a group feels a tie and a bond, it can start to lower their concerns about inequities and that there are systemic problems, and they can it will delay their action and in spaces where legislation is important. And so it's sort of this dual process of making these steps, these interpersonal steps and these personal steps, but then also not forgetting that we do need legislation and we do need policies. We do have to go in and do audits on the structures that are creating this problem that persist. But Sky, like you said, there isn't any one answer to this. I do validate your sense of fear, but I do also think that we're all having to pony up here because we did this to ourselves, really.
Thank you, Katharine.
Thank you, Sky.
You're muted, Donna.
Yep. I think in addition to all the things that you just mentioned, it's important to remember that we need the arts. We need media. We need person to person. We need protests and demonstrations. We need books. We need all of those things together, because I think if protests alone would get the job done, they would have gotten the job done. If legislation alone would get the job done, it would have gotten it done. We need the lawsuits that people bring in order to try and enforce equity. So I think I think we need all of those pieces together if we are going to get the kind of thorough healing that we're all craving. And some people have said this is why we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because until we dig out all of those rotting corpses from our history, we can't fully confront the roots of what we're experiencing today. So I appreciate the efforts of administrative organizing and legislative activity, but there's a whole world that doesn't get addressed by those things. I mean, the Civil Rights Act was signed in the 60s, and it hasn't fixed it. So we need everybody. We really need everybody, and we need
Yes.
all lines of action.
Yeah. All hands on deck. Mm-hmm.
Any more questions for Katharine? Don't be shy. Let's see. Randy wants to know, I'm curious how many educators are here tonight, and can anyone offer anecdotes about racial issues or discussions that have occurred in their classroom or school? Do you have to tiptoe around the issue? Anyone want to weigh in?
I wish Kim Ledesma would talk about what she's doing, but I will not put her on the spot. Will I, Kim? No.
Yeah, so I have spoken about race in some of the classrooms that I've visited. My name's Ebony. And I've been thinking about some of the kids who responded to some of the things that I've said. So sometimes when I'm going into a classroom from the library, teachers will leave because that's their time to use the restroom and get their coffee. So often it's just me in the class. And so I had been talking about a book that was about a girl who is experiencing racism in the Jim Crow South. And I don't warn the kids. And so it doesn't come with a trigger warning. And the kids are often like, oh my goodness, right? They're shocked. And so in this class in which the teacher had left, one of the girls, she said to me, I don't like this story. I am Black. I do not look Black, but I am. And we in this class do not like racism, and that is racism. And this girl went off. And I was never happier than that she had that opportunity to take the role of leader from me and demand it for the class. And the class was like, yeah. I was like, oh my goodness. So at least for me, that made me feel very, very hopeful that generation is not going to respond to racism in the ways that people have in the past. And I've had that experience a number of times where kids have, in their own ways, told me, no, I don't think that is correct what you said. Because I often will slip things in that are not quite correct to see if anyone will correct me. I did that in one classroom. I was talking about the Titanic. And when the Titanic was rescued, they rescued the richest people first, and they did it by class. And so most of the people who died when the Titanic sank were the poorest people. And one girl stood up and she corrected me, very polite Latina girl. She said, I'm sorry, but that's not okay. You can't just say that someone's life is worth less because they don't have as much money. And she was very succinct and she was very polite about it, but she was very firm. And I was like, okay, there's another leader, right? There's another person who isn't just gonna let the adult in the classroom say something and perhaps some of the kids thinking that's okay. No, you. Some kids probably think, oh, this teacher knows better than what she's saying. But you can't, if you're a kid, you can't necessarily,
Right.
hope all of your students understand what's happening, all of your classmates. So I see lots of hopeful signs.
I think we have a lot more media now that is doing a better job of representation, a lot more than our generation had, than we had. certainly books and television and movies. I mean, at this point, like even ad agencies are learning about the importance of these countering the stereotypes, right? And they're doing it for a different reason. I mean, for them, it's often in the dollar sign, but what they've learned is this idea of counter stereotyping. They've learned that when you want eyeballs on the screen, you want to have that element of surprise. And what always triggers that element of surprise, or what can, is something that's counter to what you think and counter to what you know. And that makes you pay more attention in that. And so they sort of have this ethical, this ethical motivation ends up actually giving them, an economic incentive too. That seeing diversity, seeing things that are different and twisted, that turn things on their head, are very powerful motivators to get people to think and to slow down and to pay attention. So, but I do know, Kim, are you willing to talk about it? Because I think this is an example of how schools can start to think about all of this different. Kim is a math teacher in the high school level. And a lot of people will sort of talk about, my subject has nothing to do with MACE, or my subject can't really address these things. But I think the last I heard, Kim, you were involved in a project where they're trying to do this in some of the public schools here.
So sure, I'd be happy to share, and I will preface it by saying I haven't implemented any of this yet, but I took a workshop last summer for public school teachers, high school math teachers who wanted to implement a course in their school called Math for Social Justice. And essentially, it's a math class for high school students that looks at social justice issues through the lens of mathematics. There are a variety of lessons on all kinds of topics. And I have proposed a course, this course, to be implemented at my school starting next year. And so it's in the process of being approved. And if it happens, then I will be teaching that at my high school next year. So I would mention, since there was a question about kind of, how these things are received in some of the different schools. So far, all that's happened is that I've submitted this proposal to the administration for the course. But as soon as other members of the math department heard about it, there were concerns. So I guess I would preface by saying the school that I work in has a very diverse student body. We have over 40 languages are represented in our school, and the population is less than half white, and the rest are all kinds of groups. But the staff is almost 100% white. It's not a diverse staff at all, and the math department is almost all white. And so, I was asked to, give a little more detail at a department meeting, and there were, some of the questions that my colleagues asked me were, I guess, telling. One individual was asking about whether the lessons were designed to make white people look bad. Yeah. And it's just like, so that was one question that I got. And another one was essentially questioning whether injustice really exists at all. Yeah, I know people are, you guys, I know. And so, I mean, fortunately, this was only one or two individuals, and several of my other colleagues were speaking up. I hardly had to say anything. And the principal was in the room, and she was also, speaking up for how important this was. And so I feel confident that it's going to move forward, but there's still just so much work to be done.
Mm.
So much work to be done. So.
Oh.
But hopefully by this time next year, I'll be teaching the class, so we'll see how it goes.
That's awesome.
Adrian and
Bernadette, is
Bernadette?
your hand up? I see a hand up.
Yes, Kim, you should know there is a book for middle schoolers, and I'll try to make sure this list gets posted on the Take Part site. And it's about Black mathematicians and scientists, people who actually contributed to the math and sciences.
Sounds like some of your colleagues could learn from it.
And I think
Yeah, I would actually love to have that resource.
the problem is often people don't know that Black people did anything between, say, slavery and the civil rights, because when I grew up, there was certainly no discussion of it. And so what I have done, and what I urge all of you to do, is when you have kids in your life or grandchildren, that you buy them books about Black people. There has been an explosion of books about people of color, and the best stuff is at the children's level. For example, there's a book about the Aztec eagles, and this is a group of people from Mexico who agreed to, for the United States, join them, get trained here, and provide Air Force services to protect our military forces in the Philippines. And it was written by a woman who traveled to Mexico and saw the school and learned about the story as a result of that. But there are no adult books on it. There's only this children's book. And there are many books like that that expand your knowledge of what you think people are, and to understand the contributions of people of Mexican descent in this country for many different things over the years. And so all of this matters. But most importantly, I think everyone needs to be conscious of the fact that because of the internet, you can't, it's like Pandora's box. The information is out there, the kids will find it. And if you don't make sure you're the one who gives it to them, they will be angry. There was a college student who did a play, a one-woman play about finding out that there were racial covenants in Portland. And she wanted to know why. She had never been taught this in school. She's 22 years old. And she had never been taught this. And she was horrified as she researched to find about Oregon's history, because none of it is taught in school. And people are afraid that, you know, it's going to make white people look bad or feel bad. But if you just teach about, you know, like everybody knows about the peanut guy, Carver, you know, if you have Black and Asian people that kids learn about from the beginning as just part of life, that's not demonizing anyone, it's expanding the story. And I think that's the way it has to be seen, as it's expanding the story.
Yeah, I think another talk that was really helpful in that for us as teachers here in Oregon was Gregory Noakes' talk. I think Take Part did that, and he has another book coming out. So I think but all of these things are that can really help us as educators to, particularly when we're doing units on the history of our different localities, to have people who are doing that for us is really powerful. And to share those stories is really important.
Well, friends, it's about 8:40, and we should begin wrapping up our evening. Does anyone else have any burning questions for Katharine before we bring this time to a close? All right, thank you everyone for being here.
I was going to say something.
Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that story about Chris Cooper, the Black man who is a birder in the New York Central Park. That is a fascinating story for a number of reasons. Yes, he's a Black birder, but he's gay. he's upper class, not even upper middle class, but upper class. He worked for a comic book company and made his own comic. So, I mean, there are a number of avenues that you could explore with that. And the story is a complicated one, yes. But ultimately, when, I forget the woman's name, but her name is also Cooper, they're both Coopers. When she calls the police on Chris, she understands that he is no longer a threat to her. So she understood that if I, a white woman, say that this Black man is attacking me, I can have my way and let my dog be off leash in the bramble. And so I think I would really be interested in seeing how young people, how they digested and how they analyzed that story, that very complicated story, and what they made of it. And I think there are all sorts of opportunities to do that in the classroom, but not everybody is, not everybody is ready to do that yet. But there are a lot of people who are. So.
Thank you, Ebony. Anyone else? Okay, thank you so much, everyone, for being with us this evening. Our deep, deep gratitude to Katharine for sharing her magnificent presentation and tremendous personality with us this evening. And we are so grateful to everyone who attends and to all of our supporters. We will be taking the month of December to do some strategic planning work, and we are looking forward to seeing everybody back in January. So thank you so much, and we will see you next time. The video will be posted on our YouTube channel in the coming days. Thank you so much.